Karen was the kind of person who thrived on attention. Back in her small town in Ohio, she was infamous for her bold antics and knack for turning every situation into a story worth telling. Whether it was sneaking onto a roller coaster without waiting in line or convincing her friends to join her in a flash mob at the local mall, Karen lived for moments that made people talk. Her latest adventure, a trip to London with three of her closest and most mischievous friends. The moment they landed, Karen's excitement was palpable. She had dreamt of visiting Buckingham Palace ever since she saw pictures of the iconic building in a history book as a child. But now that she was standing there, gazing up at its grandeur, her mind wasn't focused on history or royalty. No, Karen's thoughts were already racing ahead to how she could make this visit uniquely hers. After all, what was the point of traveling halfway around the world if you didn't have a wild story to bring back? As they approached the gates of the palace, Karen noticed the royal guards stationed nearby. Their bright red coats and tall bearskin hats stood out against the gray London sky. They looked almost statuesque, standing perfectly still as tourists snapped photos and giggled around them. Some visitors tried to get their attention by waving brightly colored scarves or making silly faces, but the guards didn't budge an inch. It was like watching living mannequins, and while most people admired their discipline, Karen found it oddly amusing. "Can you believe these guys?" Karen said to her friends, pointing at one guard whose expression seemed carved out of stone. "They're just standing there like robots. Don't they ever crack?" Her friend Mia rolled her eyes. "That's literally their job, Karen. To stand still, no matter what." "Yeah, but come on," Karen replied with a smirk. "What would it take to actually get a reaction out of them? You'd think someone would have figured it out by now." Mia shrugged, uninterested, but another friend, Jake, perked up. "I bet nothing works. They're trained professionals. Supposedly, they don't even blink unless they absolutely have to." Karen raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, really? We'll see about that." Her competitive streak kicked in. If everyone else thought the guards were untouchable, then Karen saw it as a challenge. She glanced down at her purse, where a small canister of pepper spray sat tucked inside, a souvenir from a self-defense class she took years ago. At the time, she joked about using it on anyone who annoyed her. Now, staring at the stoic guard, an idea began to form. "Watch this," Karen whispered, her lips curling into a mischievous grin. Her friends exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what she was planning. But Karen didn't hesitate. This was her chance to do something unforgettable, to create a story so outrageous it would become legend among her circle of friends. Little did she know, however, that sometimes the most memorable moments aren't always the ones you want to remember. As Karen stood there, staring at the royal guard with a mischievous glint in her eye, her mind raced with possibilities. She had always prided herself on being unpredictable, someone who could turn even the most mundane situations into something extraordinary. But this wasn't just any ordinary situation. This was Buckingham Palace, one of the most iconic landmarks in the world. And these weren't just ordinary people standing around. They were royal guards, symbols of tradition and discipline. Karen's grip tightened on the strap of her purse as she considered what she was about to do. The idea that had sparked in her mind moments ago was reckless, maybe even dangerous. But it thrilled her. What if I could make him move? She thought to herself, her pulse quickening. What if I could actually get a reaction out of him? That would be legendary. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor. Jake leaned closer, his voice low and cautious. "Karen, don't even think about it. You're not seriously considering doing something stupid, are you?" "Stupid?" Karen shot back, feigning offense. "I'm not stupid. I'm spontaneous. Besides, how often do we get to mess with royalty? This is once-in-a-lifetime stuff." Mia chimed in, crossing her arms. "It's not funny, Karen. These guys are professionals. They're trained to handle way worse than some tourists trying to annoy them. You'll just embarrass yourself." But Karen wasn't listening. In fact, Their skepticism only fueled her determination. If anything, she wanted to prove them wrong. She wanted to show them that she wasn't afraid to take risks, even if it meant going against the grain. Pulling her purse closer, she discreetly slid her hand inside and felt the cold metal of the pepper spray canister. It was small enough to go unnoticed, but powerful enough to leave an impact, or so she thought. The guard she had been watching hadn't moved an inch. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead as though nothing around him existed. Tourists continued to mill about, taking pictures and laughing, completely unaware of the chaos brewing in Karen's mind. To everyone else, the scene was peaceful, almost serene. But for Karen, it was a stage, and she was ready to perform. "What are you planning, Karen?" Jake asked again, his tone sharper this time. He knew her well enough to recognize when trouble was imminent. Karen smirked, refusing to answer directly. Instead, she took a step forward, positioning herself closer to the guard. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of excitement and nervous energy coursing through her veins. She glanced over her shoulder at her friends, silently daring them to stop her. When no one did, she felt emboldened. "This is going to be hilarious," Karen muttered under her breath, gripping the pepper spray tightly. She imagined the guard flinching dramatically, breaking his stoic stance in front of the crowd. She pictured the gasps, the laughter, the shock on people's faces. In her mind, it was all part of the fun, a harmless prank designed to break the monotony of the day. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered that maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. What if something went wrong? What if the guard reacted differently than she expected? For a split second, doubt crept in, but Karen quickly pushed it aside. She was too far gone now, too caught up in the thrill of the moment to turn back. With one final glance at her friends, who looked equal parts confused and concerned, Karen made her decision. She didn't care about the consequences, at least, not yet. All she cared about was making a splash, leaving her mark on this historic place in a way no one else had dared to try. Little did she know, the ripple effects of her actions would reach far beyond what she could have ever imagined. Karen's fingers tightened around the small canister of pepper spray as she inched closer to the royal guard. The crowd around her buzzed with chatter and laughter, completely oblivious to the storm about to break. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. She could almost hear the gasps of shock, the eruption of surprised laughter from her friends, and the story they'd tell over and over again back home. With a quick glance to make sure no one was paying too much attention to her, Karen lifted her arm slightly, aiming the nozzle toward the guard's face. A split second later, she pressed down on the trigger. A fine mist shot out, catching the edge of the guard's cheek and drifting toward his eyes. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The tourists closest to the scene stopped mid-motion. Someone's camera hung suspended in the air. Another person's mouth gaped open in disbelief. Even the faint hum of conversation died down, replaced by an eerie silence. Karen grinned, waiting for the dramatic reaction she had envisioned. Surely, the guard would flinch or blink wildly, maybe even stumble backward in surprise. That's what always happened in movies, right? But instead, nothing changed. The guard remained perfectly still, his expression unaltered, as though he hadn't even noticed the stinging spray now clinging to his skin. His unwavering gaze stayed fixed straight ahead, betraying no sign of discomfort. At first, Karen thought it might be part of the act, a final show of stoicism before he cracked. But as seconds ticked by and the guard didn't move, her grin began to falter. Something felt off. The crowd, which had initially fallen silent, started murmuring among themselves. People exchanged confused glances, some pointing at Karen while others stared at the guard in awe. It was clear that this wasn't the reaction anyone had expected, not even Karen. Her friends were frozen in place, their expressions a mix of horror and disbelief. "Karen, what did you just do?" Mia hissed, her voice trembling. Jake looked pale, shaking his head slowly as if trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Karen swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The laughter she had anticipated never came. Instead, the atmosphere grew tense, almost suffocating. She forced a nervous chuckle, attempting to brush off the awkwardness. "Relax, guys," she said, her voice louder than usual in an effort to sound confident. "It's just a little prank. He'll be fine." But the guard's lack of response wasn't the only thing that made Karen uneasy. Around her, the mood of the crowd shifted dramatically. What had started as innocent curiosity quickly turned into disapproval. Some people glared at her, whispering angrily under their breath. Others pulled out their phones, snapping photos and recording videos of the scene. Karen realized, with growing dread, that she was no longer the center of attention in a fun, lighthearted way. She was the center of something far more serious. And then it hit her. This wasn't a game anymore. As the murmurs grew louder and the stares more intense, Karen felt a knot form in her stomach. For the first time since arriving at Buckingham Palace, she wished she could turn back time. But it was too late. The damage was done. And standing there, surrounded by judgmental eyes and the unyielding presence of the guard, Karen finally understood that her reckless decision might have consequences far beyond anything she'd ever imagined. The seconds felt like hours as Karen stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. The guard hadn't moved an inch, his composure unshaken despite the pepper spray now lingering on his skin. To Karen, it was almost surreal. How could someone endure something so uncomfortable without even flinching? But what unsettled her even more was the growing tension around her. The crowd that had once been carefree and cheerful now radiated disapproval, their whispers sharp and accusatory. Karen's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. Should she apologize? Laugh it off? Pretend nothing happened and walk away? Before she could decide, the guard finally made a move, but not in the way Karen expected. With slow, deliberate precision, he raised one gloved hand to his earpiece and spoke into it, his voice calm but firm. Though Karen couldn't hear exactly what he said, the tone sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't angry or panicked. It was authoritative, the kind of voice that demanded respect and obedience. Within moments, two other guards nearby turned their attention to the scene. They exchanged quick glances before signaling to security personnel stationed farther back. Karen watched in stunned silence as uniformed officers began making their way toward her, their expressions stern and purposeful. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a clear path between Karen and the approaching authorities. For the first time since arriving at Buckingham Palace, Karen felt truly exposed. Her friends were frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. "Karen, say something," Mia whispered urgently, tugging at her sleeve. But Karen couldn't find the words. Her throat felt dry, her mind blank. All she could do was stand there, clutching the pepper spray canister tightly in her hand, as the reality of the situation sank in. When the security officers reached her, they wasted no time. One of them stepped forward, his posture commanding yet controlled. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," he said firmly, his British accent clipped and professional. His eyes flicked briefly to the canister in her hand before locking onto hers. There was no room for negotiation. Karen's stomach dropped. Wait. I didn't mean any harm," she stammered, her voice trembling. "It was just a joke. I didn't think it was a big deal." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he gestured for her to follow him, his demeanor leaving no doubt that resistance would only make things worse. Reluctantly, Karen obeyed, her legs feeling like lead as she took each step. As she passed through the crowd, she avoided meeting anyone's gaze, unable to bear the weight of their stares. Some people shook their heads in disappointment. Others muttered under their breath about disrespect and recklessness. Behind her, the original guard remained motionless, his presence still dominating the area. Despite everything, Karen couldn't help but glance back at him one last time. His expression hadn't changed, Not even a hint of irritation or discomfort. If anything, he seemed completely unfazed by the chaos unfolding around him. It was as if Karen's actions had barely registered, which somehow made her feel even smaller. As they led her away from the palace gates, Karen's mind raced with questions. What would happen to her now? Would she be arrested? Fined? Deported? The thought of facing legal consequences terrified her, but what scared her even more was the idea of being labeled as someone who disrespected such a historic institution. She had always prided herself on being bold and fearless, but now those traits felt reckless and immature. By the time they reached a nearby security office, Karen's bravado had vanished entirely. Her hands trembled as she handed over the pepper spray when asked, and her voice cracked as she repeated her apologies over and over again. But deep down, she knew that sorry wouldn't be enough. Not this time. Whatever happened next, Karen understood that her actions had consequences far beyond her control. And as she sat there, waiting for the officers to decide her fate, she realized that this moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. Inside the small security office, Karen sat slumped in a hard plastic chair, her mind spinning with regret and panic. The room was plain and sterile, with pale walls, and a single desk cluttered with papers and radios. Two officers stood nearby, their expressions unreadable as they discussed what to do next. One of them occasionally glanced at Karen, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to figure out how someone could be so reckless. Karen's hands were clasped tightly together in her lap, her knuckles white from the tension. She replayed the scene outside over and over in her head. The guard's stoic expression, the crowd's disapproving stares, and the moment she realized her prank had gone horribly wrong. Now, sitting here under the scrutiny of these officers, she felt utterly powerless. Every second that passed seemed to stretch on forever, amplifying her anxiety. Finally, one of the officers turned to face her. "Miss Thompson," he began, his tone measured but firm, "you are aware that assaulting a member of the Royal Guard is a serious offense, correct?" He didn't raise his voice, but there was an underlying authority in his words that made Karen shrink back in her seat. I didn't mean to assault anyone," Karen stammered, her voice cracking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought it would just, I don't know, make him blink or something. It was supposed to be funny." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by her explanation. "Funny? You brought a weapon onto royal property and used it against someone performing their duty. Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Karen opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it again. What could she say? That she hadn't thought it through. That she'd been blinded by her own need for attention. None of those excuses sounded good enough, even to her. Instead, she nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I really didn't mean for this to happen." The officer sighed and exchanged a glance with his colleague before continuing. "Regardless of your intentions, actions have consequences. You'll be charged with assault, which carries significant penalties. We'll also need to contact the U.S. Embassy to inform them of the incident." At the mention of charges, Karen's heart sank. She had heard stories about tourists getting into trouble abroad, but she never imagined it would happen to her. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Would she end up in jail? Would she lose her passport? How would she explain this to her family? As if reading her thoughts, the officer added, "You'll likely be released on bail until your court date, but you must understand that this is not something we take lightly. Assaulting a royal guard is not only disrespectful, it's a violation of the law." By now, Karen was sobbing quietly, her earlier bravado completely shattered. She kept repeating the same phrase, "I'm so sorry." But apologies couldn't undo what she had done. Outside the window, she could see flashes of cameras as news crews gathered near the palace gates. Word of her stunt had spread fast, and soon the entire world would know about the American tourist who pepper-sprayed a royal guard. For fun. When the officers finally allowed her to call her friends, Karen begged them to bring her some money for bail. They arrived shortly after, looking both angry and worried. "Karen, what were you thinking?" Jake asked, his voice filled with frustration. "Do you realize how bad this looks?" She shook her head, unable to speak through her tears. All she wanted was to rewind time, to go back to the moment before she pulled out the pepper spray and make a different choice. But it was too late. As the officers led her out of the office and handed her over to her friends, Karen knew her life would never be the same. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her, heavier than anything she had ever experienced. And as they walked away from Buckingham Palace, the stares of strangers burning into her back, Karen couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever recover from the fallout of her ill-conceived prank. Back in her hotel room, Karen stared blankly at the wall, the events of the day replaying in her mind like a broken record. The humiliation, the charges, the looks of disappointment from her friends. It all felt surreal, as though she were living someone else's nightmare. But this was her reality now, and there was no escaping it. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the bedside table, notifications piling up faster than she could ignore them. Social media had exploded with videos and photos of her infamous stunt, each post accompanied by harsh comments from strangers dissecting her actions. "Look at this lunatic," one commenter wrote. "This is why people think Americans are rude." Another chimed in, "She deserves to be banned from the UK forever." Total disrespect. Karen scrolled through the endless stream of criticism, her stomach churning with every word. For every negative comment, there were a few defending her, saying things like, "She didn't know any better," or "It's just a dumb mistake." But those voices were drowned out by the overwhelming tide of anger directed at her. Even worse, local news outlets had picked up the story, dubbing her the pepper spray tourist. Overnight, Karen had become a global symbol of recklessness and poor judgment. Her friends tried to console her, but their words only added to her guilt. "You should have thought about this before doing something so stupid," Maya said, shaking her head. "Now everyone thinks we're idiots too, because we were with you." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I mean, come on, Karen. Did you really think spraying a guard at Buckingham Palace wouldn't blow up in your face? You can't just do whatever you want without consequences." Karen buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by shame. "I know, okay. I messed up. I get it. But what am I supposed to do now? How do I fix this?" The truth was, there wasn't an easy answer. The legal process was already underway, and Karen's court date loomed over her like a dark cloud. She'd been told that assaulting a royal guard carried hefty fines and potential jail time, though deportation seemed more likely given her status as a foreigner. Still, the financial burden alone would be crippling. Her family back home had already started scrambling to gather funds for her legal fees. To make matters worse, the backlash wasn't limited to online trolls and news headlines. When Karen ventured out of the hotel the next morning to grab coffee, she noticed people whispering and pointing at her. Some gave her dirty looks, others outright avoided her altogether. Even the barista at the cafe seemed hesitant to serve her, glancing nervously at the group of tourists nearby who were discussing the incident. That evening, Karen decided to draft a public apology. It wasn't her idea. Her lawyer had insisted it might help mitigate some of the damage. But she knew it was necessary. Sitting at the tiny desk in her room, she typed out a statement explaining that her actions were impulsive and misguided, not malicious. She expressed deep remorse for disrespecting the royal guards and apologized to anyone offended by her behavior. When the post went live, reactions were mixed. Some praised her for owning up to her mistake, while others dismissed her apology as insincere damage control. "She only cares because she got caught," one person commented. Another replied, "If she's really sorry, she'll never set foot in the UK again." As the days passed, Karen began to realize that apologies couldn't erase the harm she'd caused. No matter how genuine her regret, the image of her standing outside Buckingham Palace with a canister of pepper spray would linger in people's minds. The incident had become part of her identity, whether she liked it or not. And as she packed her bags to leave London, preparing to face the fallout back home, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward redemption, or perhaps acceptance of the fact that some mistakes leave permanent scars. Karen stepped off the plane in Ohio, her heart heavy with dread. The familiar sights and sounds of home did little to comfort her. She had spent the long flight replaying every detail of her misadventure in London. The prank gone wrong, the arrest, the public shaming, and now she was back where it all began. But this wasn't the triumphant return she'd once imagined after a fun-filled vacation. Instead, she felt like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed almost immediately as she walked through the airport terminal. Notifications poured in, messages from friends, news alerts about her court case, and countless tagged posts on social media. People were still talking about her, dissecting her apology and debating whether she deserved forgiveness. Some called her reckless. Others labeled her selfish. Even local news stations had picked up the story, turning her into a cautionary tale for their viewers. Karen wanted nothing more than to disappear, but there was no escaping the spotlight she had unwittingly created for herself. At first, she tried to lay low. She avoided going out, canceled plans with friends, and spent most of her time holed up in her apartment. But staying hidden didn't stop the fallout. Her neighbors whispered behind her back when they saw her at the grocery store. A few people even confronted her directly, asking why she thought it was okay to embarrass her country on an international stage. Each interaction left Karen feeling smaller and more isolated. Her family tried to support her, though they struggled to understand how she could have been so careless. "We raised you better than this," her mother said during one particularly tense dinner conversation. "You've always been headstrong, but this is beyond anything we ever expected." "I know, Mom," Karen replied softly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I messed up. I didn't think it would turn into this." Her father chimed in, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's not just about thinking, Karen. You acted without considering the consequences, for yourself or anyone else. Now you're paying the price, and honestly, it might take a long time to rebuild trust." Rebuilding trust was easier said than done. Karen found herself constantly second-guessing her actions, afraid that even the smallest mistake would be magnified because of her past. She started attending therapy sessions, hoping to unpack the impulsiveness that had landed her in this situation. Over time, she began to see patterns in her behavior, how her need for attention often overshadowed common sense, how she craved validation at the expense of others' feelings. It was humbling, painful work, but Karen knew she needed to change if she ever wanted to move forward. Despite her efforts, redemption proved elusive. Friends who had once laughed at her antics now kept their distance, unsure of how to reconcile the person they knew with the image plastered across headlines. Invitations stopped coming, and casual conversations became awkward. Even her job wasn't immune to the backlash. A coworker mentioned hearing rumors that clients were hesitant to work with her because of the negative publicity. As weeks turned into months, Karen realized that some mistakes leave scars that never fully heal. While she couldn't undo what she had done, she resolved to live differently moving forward. She volunteered at community events, focusing on acts of kindness rather than attention-seeking stunts. She wrote letters to organizations promoting cultural understanding, sharing her story as a reminder of the importance of respecting boundaries. And she learned to sit quietly with her regrets, using them as motivation to grow. Still, the shadow of her infamous decision lingered. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed distant, Karen would find herself thinking about the stoic guard at Buckingham Palace. His unwavering composure haunted her, a stark contrast to her own impulsiveness. In those moments, she understood that her journey toward redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, one thoughtful step at a time. Months had passed since Karen's ill-fated trip to London, but the memory of that day still lingered in her mind like an unshakable shadow. Sitting alone on her couch one quiet evening, she scrolled through old photos on her phone. snapshots of happier times before her life became a cautionary tale. There she was at Niagara Falls, arms outstretched with a wide grin. Another picture showed her laughing with friends during a road trip, their faces glowing in the golden light of sunset. Back then, everything had felt so carefree, so full of possibility. Now, those moments seemed like relics from a different lifetime. Karen sighed and set her phone aside, staring blankly at the wall. She had spent countless nights replaying the events of that day in her mind: the pepper spray, the stoic guard, the crowd's gasps, and the cold stares of disapproval. Each detail was etched into her memory, impossible to erase no matter how hard she tried. At times, she wondered if she'd ever be able to look back on her life without cringing at the thought of what she had done. But as painful as it was, Karen also knew she couldn't keep running from her past. Over time, she had come to accept that some mistakes leave permanent marks. And that was okay. What mattered most wasn't erasing the memory but learning to live alongside it. Therapy had helped her understand why she acted impulsively, seeking validation in ways that often hurt others. Volunteering and mentoring young people about responsible decision-making gave her a sense of purpose, even if it didn't undo the damage she'd caused. Still, there were moments when the weight of her actions felt unbearable. One afternoon, while scrolling through social media, Karen stumbled across yet another article about her infamous stunt. The headline read, "The Pepper Spray Tourist, a Lesson in Accountability." Her stomach churned as she read the comments below, many of which were still critical, though fewer than before. Some readers expressed sympathy, acknowledging that everyone makes mistakes. Others remained unforgiving, calling her reckless behavior unforgivable. For a moment, Karen considered deleting the app altogether, but something stopped her. Instead, she scrolled further, noticing a comment from someone who identified themselves as a former tourist who had visited Buckingham Palace recently. "I saw the guards today," the commenter wrote. "They were amazing, so disciplined and respectful. It made me think twice about my own actions when traveling. Thanks for reminding us all to be better." That single comment struck a chord deep within Karen. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope, not because she sought forgiveness, but because her mistake might have inspired someone else to reflect on their choices. If even one person learned something valuable from her story, perhaps it wasn't entirely meaningless. As weeks turned into years, Karen continued working to rebuild her life. She eventually returned to work, earning back the trust of colleagues and clients through consistent effort and humility. Friends slowly began reaching out again, though their relationships weren't quite the same as before. And while she still encountered whispers and judgmental stares in public, they no longer paralyzed her with shame. Instead, she used those moments as reminders of how far she'd come, and how much farther she still had to go. Late one night, Karen found herself thinking about the royal guard once more. His unwavering composure had been the thing that first challenged her perspective, forcing her to confront the consequences of her actions. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he remembered the day a brash American tourist disrupted his routine. Somehow, she doubted it. Guards like him were trained to remain unaffected by chaos, to stand tall regardless of what happened around them. To Karen, he represented discipline, patience, and resilience, qualities she hoped to embody moving forward. In the end, Karen realized that redemption wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about growth, accountability, and choosing to live differently despite the scars left behind. As she turned off the lights and headed to bed, she reminded herself of the lessons she had learned, that every action has consequences, that respect matters more than attention, and that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the greatest transformations. And though she would always carry the weight of her mistake, she now saw it not just as a source of regret, but as a turning point that shaped the person she was becoming.